Hey there, Magic Monsters. Welcome to this tutorial using the game modules in order to create a hunger system. Now you can get the game modules by going to infinitypbr.com, click on the See All Assets, and get into the asset store with my affiliate link, and I appreciate use of my affiliate link. Search for game modules, and you'll find the game modules bundle right here. And in this tutorial, we're going to utilize the stats, game time, and condition systems in order to create a hunger system using the game modules. So I have a very basic scene here. I've got my player here, and it's represented by this player model that's just a capsule. We're not going to actually be using really any graphics for this, so we just have a nice green background and pleasing gray capsule to look at. First thing I'm going to do inside my hunger system tutorial folder here is create a new folder called scripts. And in this folder, we're going to create a script. We're going to call this player. We'll load up this player script, and we're going to make sure we use a namespace that's something unique. So we're going to use Infinity PBR tutorials, and we'll say hunger system. And that's just going to keep this separate from any other conflicts from any other player class that you might have in your project. Although generally I would suggest that you do not put this system directly into a game project that you're already working on. We're going to make sure that this is serializable as well. And for now, we'll just delete this and think about what we need for our player here. So we know that we're going to be using the stats and the conditions. There are two ways to get the stats and condition system into our player class here. One quick way is just to use the demo scene. In this project, I've included the stats demo, and this also has a script called stats demo player. This script is not mono behavior, and it already has I have stats, I have conditions set up, and all the required methods are already set up here as well. So one thing we could do is say public stats demo player. If we drag this player class here, we will have all of our player data here. We already have our game conditions list. We even have a game item object list, and our skills and our stats, which are both game stats lists. Now that's a very quick way of doing it, and then you can modify this as you see fit. In fact, you could change the name of this entirely, make a copy of it so it has a different GUID inside Unity, and then just use it. So that's one way of doing it. We're going to show the other way right now, which is setting it up sort of from scratch, although we will take from that script as well. And to do this, we're going to say I have stats and I have conditions. Now both of these do have a bunch of required methods, members to implement here. So we're going to go ahead and add all of these in. So of course they're going to start out with all not implemented exceptions here. As a reminder, the game modules doesn't force you to make your game any specific way. The idea behind the systems is that for the most part, they're there to make things easier, to help organize and create data, but how you use that data is completely up to you. So methods like gaining a stat or removing a stat, generally they're going to be very similar, but you might have additional code in your project that isn't in the demo project. So keep in mind that you're very free and expected to create your own code and add to this code as your game needs it to make your game your game. Now, instead of writing all of this from scratch, we're still going to steal from the demo player. Most of these methods are quite usable, and so I'm just going to basically copy these from here into my player over here. All right, with those copied over, you can see here that we have a lot of red in Rider, which means there are a lot of just bugs. And that's because we haven't really actually set up other things that we're required to have here. So the first thing is the stats. So in our player, we know that our player needs a stats list. And so we're going to do a public game stats list. We're going to call this stats. Now for this project, we don't actually need these skills. And of course, if any other missing references are not there, go ahead and add those. We're not going to be using skills for this, so I'm just going to remove this and remove this. Now the get other levels method is very important. This is how you compile all the different influences on your stats from different things like game item objects, game item attributes, or conditions as well. In this scene, we're not going to have a character class or a character race, so we're just going to delete that. And we're also not going to have equipment, so we'll delete that as well. Our conditions here, we are going to have conditions, so I'm going to go back up to the top here, and we're going to do a public game conditions list, and we're going to call this conditions. Now we have this method called getGameTime. The condition module requires some sort of timekeeping in order to do the periodic actions and to self-expire conditions when their time is run out. And so we do need a reference to game time. We'll come back to that for now, and so for now we'll just return null and comment out the rest of that line. The tick method is also extremely important. This needs to be called in our update. So while we're thinking about it, let's go up to the top here and we'll recreate our update method. And we'll call the tick method. Tick calls tick on all of our lists. So in this case, we have our stats list, and we can remove the skills list, and we have the conditions as well. Now, if you look at the condition tick, it's different from the others in that it optionally has a flow for the game time now. This is where we would pass in game time now. So we're going to do that in a bit, but for now, we will just comment this out until we set up our game time, and then we'll come back and fix that. For our get owner name, we're just going to keep this as tutorial. Now we've come to this is set up bool here. And so we do want to add this. With the game modules, there are some connections that need to be made, often between the game version and the scriptable object data, or to the repositories that we're going to be adding to the scene. And so we want to do those in the awake method, and there's other things that we don't really want to have happen until each script is set up. So oftentimes we'll add an isSetUp boolean to each script, and we're going to do that right up here. And then in our update, we're going to say if it's not set up, then return. This way, update will only happen when we are set up. In fact, I'm going to change this into a method itself. So in this method, we'll return true if we're already set up. Otherwise, we'll do setup here. And that's going to end up with is setup equals true. All right, so now let's go ahead and add our game time. We're going to create a new object, and we're going to call this game time object. And we're going to create a new script here and call this script game time object as well. We'll bring that onto our object, and we'll load up the script here. Now game time itself is non-mono behavior, and so we have to add it to another data class. Often this will be some sort of data class that you're going to be serializing or something like that. So let's go ahead and copy over our namespace and the system serializable, and then we're going to do a public game time. And we need to make sure we import the missing references here. In this case, we're using Infinity PBR modules, and now we have our game time set up. So let's go ahead and check it out in the inspector. Now game time has these default values, which the most important ones are probably going to be the seconds per in-game minute. That means it's 3 real-world seconds per in-game minute, and all the other stuff we're going to leave at the default. Now we have our game time set up, so now we just need to get a reference to the game time from our player. So we're going to organize our inspector just a little bit with a header. So with that set, we're going to just bring our game time object right here into game time object. So now back here with our get game time, instead of this, we're just going to type in game time object.gametime. And now in the tick for our conditions, we're just going to pass in get game time.now. So at this point, we're about ready to start creating our actual stats and conditions, which are going to be the backbone of the data for the hunger system. But before we do that, we want to make sure we don't forget a very important step. Since we are using the systems here, we want to bring in these repositories. So we're going to bring in the stats and the conditions repository. We're just going to bring those right into our scene, these prefabs. If you check them out, they'll list all the different stats and all the different conditions that are already in your project. We have no conditions right now, but all these stats are actually the demo files of the stats system. I can actually now delete this because I no longer need it. We're not referencing that demo file. And now our stats repository is empty. As we create new stats and conditions, they'll automatically populate in the stats repository. And these repositories are the automatic connection between our runtime versions of these objects and the scriptable objects themselves, which are the things that hold all the data that you set up. The scriptable objects are not intended to be modified at runtime, while the runtime versions are, but often they need to reference back to the scriptable objects, and they do so automatically through the repository. So you'll just need these in your scenes in order to enable that functionality. So what are we going to do with this is setup? What are we waiting to have set up here? So what we're actually waiting for is this connection to game time. And while we did populate it here, we're just going to make sure that game time itself is set up. So now instead of saying just is setup is true, we're going to say is setup equals get game time and is set up. And we're going to return that value as well. All right, so let's go ahead and set up our stats first. So inside our hunger system here, I'm going to create a new folder. We're going to call this stats. And inside the stats, we're going to have two different types of stats. We're going to have our main stats, and so I'll create a new folder called main, and another folder I'm going to call this hidden. So these are going to be like our hidden stats that help the game operate and help the final values be computed, but they aren't the things that we're really going to be showing to the player themselves. Inside our main folder here, we're going to create a game modules create stat, and we're going to call this hit points. Now you'll notice that the type is going to be main. For all of the game module objects, the type of that object is the name of the folder they're in. So if I were to change this and put this in the hidden folder, then now the stat type is hidden. So we'll go and keep this in the main folder. But that's an important concept to remember. We're going to make a couple others. There's a few ways to make new ones. You could just duplicate the object, and we're going to call this hit points max. But if you do that, just keep in mind that the UID needs to be recreated because each object needs to have its own UID. We're going to do another one for might and another one for wisdom. We're keeping this fairly simple for the tutorial, so we're only going to have might and wisdom and our hit points inside the main stats here. And then in our hidden stats, we're going to have two things that's going to be part of our hunger system. We're going to have a stat called hunger level, and we're going to have a stat called metabolism. So let's go ahead and set these up first. Our hunger level, if we click on the main settings here, we're going to start this out with a value of 100 points. We're going to say it's a minimum and maximum between 0 and 100 points. And for the purpose of this tutorial, we're not going to say this can be modified or trained. So we're going to leave those blank. And then on metabolism here, on our main settings, we're going to say our point is 1. So we basically have 1 point, that's our base metabolism. A metabolism for this is going to control how fast we go through food. And that way, whenever our hunger level grows, and for this purpose, we're going to have the hunger level going down to 0. So really, whenever it goes down, it's going to be modified by the metabolism. Therefore, inside the main settings on hunger level, I'm going to bring metabolism right over here. So if we look at the tooltip here, whenever we add or subtract points to the hunger level, we are going to modify it by the proficiency of metabolism. You can look at the math on the scripts itself or on the scripting docs linked from infinitypbr.com, but essentially right now with points being 1, no extra base value, and our base proficiency being 0, that means we're essentially going to have 100% proficiency of whatever the combination of points and value is here, and that's of course 1. 1 plus 0 equals 1 times 1 equals 1. Therefore, whenever we add or subtract 1 point to the hunger level, we will add or subtract just 1. If our metabolism was a proficiency of 3, then we would add or subtract 3 points every time instead of just 1. Note that you can call add points with the parameter false to ignore this feature when adding points, and we're going to be doing that when we eat food. All right, let's go ahead and set up our main stats here as well. Our max hit points, we're going to start off at 100, and we will clamp this between 0 and 100 as well. And for our hit points, we're going to be saying this to 100 as a start, and again we'll clamp it between 0 and 100 there as well. For our might, we're going to say this can be modified, and we're going to start at 25. And our wisdom is also going to be something that can be modified, and we'll start this off at 20 just to keep it different. Now, in most cases, stats and skills are things that can be trained, things that can be modified, and things that are intended to be used like a stat for strength or a stat for, your wisdom or your luck or your speed or whatnot. Stats can also be used as counters. So that's what we're doing with the hit points and also with the hunger level, where we're using the point value as a counter. This is also useful for gold or experience or other things where the value goes up or down, but it's not something that can be modified, not something that can be trained, but it can go up and down through this system. And that's helpful because the conditions can also affect points separately from the rest of the stats that can be modified. Now, you may be wondering, well, how do I get these stats onto my player? And that's a great question. You need to do that. And there are multiple ways to do that. So I'm going to show you a couple ways right now. I'm going to start by making sure we have our properties code exported. If we go up to our window, game modules, property code, I'm going to just dock this right here because we might be coming back to this later. I'm going to click this export now button and say yes. And it's going to show me the path to the properties, which defaults to the game time modules. And this script, I'm just going to move this here into my scripts. And now whenever I click this again, it's going to export to that and overwrite this script. If we open this up, if you find it to be ill-formed right there, you can just delete the last curly bracket, and oftentimes your system will reformat it properly. And in this case, what you can see here is that we just have a whole bunch of more human readable references to our unique identifiers and to our stat scriptable objects themselves. So we're going to make use of that in just 1 second. So the first way of adding stats is just to do it in your script itself. It's a little boilerplate, but if you're just adding a few things and that's it, then maybe that's the easiest way to go about it. So the example here would be that we can say stats.add, and then inside of our add method, we're looking for a UID, the owner. In this case, it's the player, and whether it's supposed to be distinct. In many cases, it is meant to be distinct, as in you can only have one stat called hit points. So we're going to use our properties code. So just type in properties, and then here we'll have now our stats, and we have our different types here, and hit points is in our main. So we're going to use main.hitpoints UID, and then we'll type in this for the new owner. So we're going to add in the hit points. We're going to add in hit points max. We're going to add in our might. And we'll add in our wisdom. We also need our two hidden stats. So we're going to type in here hidden.metabolism and hidden.hunger level. As I mentioned earlier, the order of things matters here, and we actually got a null reference because I did this a little too early. So we actually want to move this to our setup here, and we're going to add those into our setup. So now when we press play, we can see all of these stats show up here in our list. Before I show you the second set, I want to wait to see what these values actually end up being. If you look into the inspector here, it doesn't actually show you the final value because the final value is going to be something that might be influenced by many other things in the game, like items and conditions and who knows what else. Rather than using the console and rather than printing something on screen, I'm going to show you a nice way of adding the data we want to see into the inspector itself that can show up just as a component on the inspector, so it's a lot easier to see what's going on inside this player. So in our scripts here, we're going to create yet another new script. We're going to call this player data viewer. We're also going to create a new folder inside our script here and call this editor. and inside our editor, another script, and call this player viewer or player data viewer editor. The editor is going to be a custom inspector. So the first thing we're going to do is for both of these, put them in the same namespace we've been using. Our editor script here is going to be a custom editor, and this is going to be type of, and then player data viewer. And we're also going to say this is serializable. And instead of a mono behavior and instead of a custom editor, we're going to be using the Infinity editor, and this is going to be of type player data viewer. The Infinity editor is a custom editor I've created with a whole lot of helpful methods that makes editor scripting just a hell of a lot easier. And so if you have the game modules, then you also have the Infinity editor, in which case feel free to use it. So we're going to start by making a private reference to our script here. And as this is an editor script, we need to override the onInspector GUI. The player data viewer class isn't going to have anything going on, but just out of a good habit, I'm going to say draw default inspector here. That way, if there was anything on that class, it would show up in the inspector. And just to make sure that we don't run into any errors, we're going to do some checks to make sure that the script is populated. And if it's not, we'll just return. And then down here, we're going to do a couple things. So we're going to start out by just showing the game time. Now we're going to have to get a reference to our player. We're not going to get a reference to the player here. We're actually going to get the reference to the player on the player data viewer itself. It's a component that's going to be on the same object as the player class we've written previously. So we're going to start with a private reference to our player. I should type that right. And then we're going to do a public reference as well. And that's going to get and set our player. And finally, on our awake, we're going to say player equals get component player. And just because I want to skinny this up a little bit, we will use that, and just to make it nice and tidy. Go ahead and save that script and come over here, and we're going to make sure that none of this runs unless the player is also found. So we're going to say if no script.player, then return. Finally, since we're going to be showing game time, we need to make sure that the player is actually set up to show that. So if the script.player.is set up, then return. So if it's not set up, we'll return. So in our show game time here, we're going to start by showing a label that, and it's going to be bold. Now again, this is using the Infinity editor. So if you're used to editor scripts, you'll be more used to this style of code syntax, but since we're using the Infinity editor, I've got my shorthand here, and it's a little bit easier to write in my opinion. We're going to start a new row and then end a row. Always remember to end the row when you start it. And underneath this header for game time, we're going to say label, and we're going to write in game time and make this width of 150. And then on to the right of that, we're going to say label, and for this one, we're going to bring in our script.player.gametime.now. And if you did want to make this a little bit easier to write, then you could use a property code for this. And then you just have to write game time now. And at the end of this, we're going to add a space as well, just a vertical space. So let's go ahead and check it out and see what this looks like. We'll add the player data viewer here, and we also need to add the gametime.tick into our update here on the game time object. So now when we press play, we can see that our game time is here. And if we click, we'll see it update, but it's not updating every frame. That's because it's an editor script, so it only updates when the editor repaints, and that's often when you click or when a mouse goes over it. We can fix that, however. Inside our editor here at the very end, we're just going to call repaint, and that's going to force it to repaint every frame. Now this only happens at edit time, so it's not going to impact the actual runtime of your game once you build it, but it will have a slight impact on the game when you're running it inside the editor. So keep that in mind in case things are just going too slow for you. So now we can see that game time is being updated, and we can actually see it right here as long as we have the player selected. Let's go ahead and show our stats as well. So for player stats, we want to display the stat itself, the points, and then the final stat, just so we can get a nice, decent overview of what stats are on the player. And we're going to do this with a for each loop, but first let's start with just a kind of a header row. And then we're going to do a for each loop. So a couple things here. First, we need to create this method for showing the stat itself. And again, if we don't want to type these long things, perhaps we're going to be using this a lot, we can add another property up here. And then we can just say player stats.list. So for each stat, we're going to do a row. So again, start and end row. Then the label, the stat object name, and we'll keep this 150 width, same as the headers. We got our points. And we'll get our final stat as well. And again, make it width of 150. All right, so now when we press play, we can see we have our hit points, we have our might, wisdom, metabolism, hunger level, everything's showing here as expected. So the second of the three methods for adding stats to a actor or a character or a player, anything that has stats, to an I have stats object, is going to be using the get stat method itself. There is an option in that method to create the stat if it doesn't already exist. This is extremely helpful when you add new stats or skills later in the game, and maybe you forgot to add it to one of your characters earlier on, or even the game's already live and some of the players might not have that. They might not have even had it in their system when they created their characters. Now, when you try to call the value of that stat, you can create it if it doesn't exist. Instead, it would have thrown an error. So this is a great way to avoid the error and to avoid some simple mistakes that we all make. So we're going to comment out all of these. And I'll put a note here. So that's the first method for adding stats. We'll just keep that commented out. So I'm going to demonstrate that in this new method called add stats here. I'm going to put a comment here. This is the second method for adding stats. Now, generally, you would do this in a different part. If you're going to add stats in a setup version, then you're probably just going to use this first method here. But throughout the game, you might have areas where you are looking up stats, either when you're doing the game logic itself, interactions between different entities in the game, or perhaps in your UI or quest dialogue or something like that. So we're going to mimic that by printing these stats out to the console. We're going to use the get method, and if you see in the little tooltip here, we're passing our UID, we're using the properties code for that, and then we have this option here called add if null, and so we're going to set that to true. And then the new owner is going to be this, and the distinct is we're going to leave as true as well. That means when we call this to actually get the value, we're going to be adding it, and we're actually going to get the points for this. So once we get the stat there, we're going to get the points from that stat. So I'm going to copy this and we're going to do it 6 times. So now we can press play. We see the console's printing out the points right there, and it has added these to the list. So this is the second way to add stats. We're actually going to try out a third way as well. And this method is extremely helpful if you're setting up enemies or other entities where you have the same stats, but perhaps you have different values, default values that you want them to start with. And I know in my own game, whenever I set up an enemy like a goblin, maybe their might is somewhere between 12 and 14, so I often have a minimum and a maximum, and I'll create a random value at the start. So the third method is going to need a new script. So we'll create a script here, and we're going to call this player setup. And we're going to add this to the player as well, and then load up the script. Now that we've added the right namespace, we'll delete the default stuff there. And we're going to create another class here. And player setup stat. And for this one, we're going to need a stat and public int starting value. And make sure we implement or bring in the references to the game modules, to Infinity PBR.modules. And of course, don't forget to set this as serializable as well, otherwise you won't see it in the inspector. You may get quite confused. So in our awake method, we're going to say add stats. And in this one, for each, we'll also get a reference to our player. And then for each starring stat, we're going to say player.stats.add starting stat.stat.uid. And the add method actually returns that new stat. So we'll save that there, and then we'll just set the point value to our starring value. Earlier, you may remember that I mentioned the modifying values here. So we're going to set this to false. So we don't use the proficiency modifier at this point because we're just setting the points. So now in our starring stats here, I'm just going to add 6. And so we'll now set our hit points to be 100 and 100, our hunger at 100, metabolism at 1. And for this, we're going to set our might now to 25. We'll set our might to 45, and we'll set our wisdom to 30, just so that they have different values. And we'll go ahead and press play. And you'll see that we got an error here. And this is because we are adding the stats in awake, and the repositories have not been registered yet. So we're actually going to move add stats to start. Now we'll press play again. Now we have our stats there, and these stats have the correct point value of 45 and 30 for might and wisdom. So this is the third method, and this is a great method for when you want to control the exact value of points, and it might be different for every single I have stats object, or add new logic, like if you want to have a min and max and randomize between the two, or who knows what other logic you'd like to do for your game. Now that we have our stats, it's time to start adding our conditions. So we're going to create a new folder here. Call this conditions. And inside our conditions, we're going to have two types of conditions. So one is going to be constant, and the other is going to be debuffs. So we'll create a new condition, create game modules, create condition, and we're going to call this getting hungry. And let's go ahead and set this up here. The thing about conditions is that they can expire. They can also have an effect on points, where most things don't have an effect on points, but our condition can have an effect on points if you choose, but it can also affect the stats. So if we expand the condition time, we're going to set this to infinite, meaning it does not expire. And the effect on points, we're going to make it periodic, and we're going to repeat this every 1 in-game minute. And the stat affected is going to be our hunger level. And we're going to reduce it by 1 every single in-game minute. So we can test this out, but of course we're going to have to add this to the character. You can add conditions at the start, just like the stats. So we're going to use the player setup here. Start by saying add conditions. And we're combining a couple of the versions of the 3 versions that I just demonstrated by using the player setup class, but we're just going to hard code the conditions. Before we're able to use the properties, however, we do need to go back to our property code because we added a new condition and export that. We don't have to do anything else. We just have to click that button. Whenever you add a new condition or item or stat or if you change their type, i.e. if you move it from one folder to another or change the name of the folder, then you need to rerun that. Otherwise, you might get into some errors. So we're going to add it with the add method that comes with the conditions module. And we're going to pass in the UID of gain hungry. We're going to pass in the player as the new owner. And null for the source. The source is like the caster, whoever gave it to the target. In this case, nobody gave it to the target. We have no effects set up on the on the condition itself that would have any impact, so we're going to leave that null. But we do want to pass in the game time now. One other thing we should add in setup is to make sure that the owner of the conditions list is the player itself. So I did make one addition to the player setup. I moved the player setup from start into update here, and this is because the game time itself wasn't set up, and so this value of now was 0, and we want to make sure the game time is set up before we do anything that requires game time. So we're going to run this in the update loop, but we're only going to do it once. So first we're going to be waiting until game time is set up, and then we'll add our stats, add our conditions, and then destroy this component. So now when we press play, we can see that the player setup disappears, but the conditions and stats have been added, and now our hunger level is going down by 1 every single in-game minute, which is 3 real-world seconds. So let's create a poison condition that's going to increase our metabolism, increase the speed at which our hunger level goes down. Create a new condition. We'll call this poison. And in our main settings here, we're going to set the condition time to be 5 in-game minutes. It's not going to be instant, it's not going to be infinite, and it's not going to have an effect on any points itself. Instead, we're going to click over to the stats tab here, find our metabolism from the list, and just as a reminder, any stat that can be modified will show up in these lists for modifications. We'll add that, and we're going to set the proficiency here to be 5. So that means that when we have this poison condition on our character, if we have the stat metabolism, then that proficiency value will go up by 5. By default, it's 1, which equals 100% of whatever value the stat is. With proficiency plus 5, that means it's going to be multiplied by 5, so that instead of losing 1 point to the hunger level, we're going to lose 5 points every in-game minute, or every 3 real-world seconds. So let's give this a try. So to set this up, I'm going to create 2 methods here just for the demo, and first one's going to be a public void get poisoned, and when we do that, we're just going to add the poison to the conditions list. Now, as a reminder, since we create a new condition, we do want to update that property code so that in Rider here we can say conditions.add properties.conditions.debuffs.poison and set the new owner to the player, and source is null, and get game time dot now. And while we're here, we're also going to add another void called eat food with an integer, and we'll say value equals 10 as a default. And for this one, we're going to add this to our hungry level here. So we'll say stats.get add points, and we're going to add in value, and we're going to also set the use proficiency modifier to false, because when we're eating food, we don't want to multiply that. If we're poisoned, we're not getting more food, so we're always going to add in whatever the value is there. Now, if you do get tired of writing this longer line every single time, you can create some properties for this as well. And then you can remove much of this code and it will be much smaller. We can do the same thing with the poison here as well. That's helpful if you're reusing the same properties code over and over and over again, so you only have to change it in one place if you ever do change the name of the object or the type of the object. Right now in our scene, in order to call this, you're going to call getting poisoned through some other method. You're going to call eating food through some other method. But for now, we're just going to create some UI buttons here. And each of these buttons, on click, we're going to select the player and choose the two methods we just created. Get poisoned, and for eat food and set the value of 10. So let's save that scene, click on the player so we can see the details, and press play. So we can see the hunger level is going down, and if I click the eat food button, it goes back up to 100. Now we're adding 10 food, but if we look at the hunger level, we've capped it at 100, so it's never going to go above 100. Even if we just keep clicking the button, it's never going to go above 100. So now if we click get poisoned, we can see it's adding to the list, but there's no effect on metabolism or the hunger level. And that's because the system needs to be told that the stats are dirty. So when we add a condition, it actually returns the new condition. So new condition is going to be cached there. And then we're going to set stats dirty. And where it's going to be stats dirty. You can set all stats or just one stat dirty. And we're going to pass in a list of stats. Now, I don't know what any condition affects. We know that this only affects metabolism, but in the game, when we add a stat or a condition, we don't actually know that, but the condition itself knows that. So we're going to pass in the new condition and the modification level, which is the thing that modifies stats, and we're going to pass in its targets. Now, that's a list of stats, and that's going to set all of those stats dirty if the receiver of this condition has those stats. So now when we click get poisoned, we have the final stat is 6 and the points are going down more. Now after 5 seconds, poison will remove itself from the list and our metabolism is back to 1 and our hunger level is going down by 1. This demonstrates one of the key aspects of the game modules, the time-saving aspect, where aside from what we've just coded, the system will operate itself. So when we get poisoned, we do have to call that it's gotten dirty, but once poison is in the system, it's going to remove itself and set all of those stats to be dirty. So let's add some new effects that happen when your hunger level gets really, really low. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you get starving, and maybe something happens when your hunger level gets to 0. We're going to add a few more constant conditions. First one is going to be hungry, and under hungry, we're going to set the condition time to be infinite so it doesn't expire. And on our settings here, we're going to add our might and our wisdom. And we're going to change the might by -5 and the wisdom by -5. Actually, let's change the might by -3. Maybe you're a little bit less strong and you're quite a bit less wise because now you're just starting to think about food a little bit. And then we're going to duplicate this one and we're going to call this starving. And then we will make might -5 and wisdom is going to be -8. And then finally, we're going to call famished. And famished is going to be might -10 and wisdom -10. And this will be when you have 0 food. You have to make sure that we create new IDs for these. And then we'll go to our property code and export the property code as well to update that. Now, in order to manage these states of hungriness, we're going to create a new script. And the script is going to be called hunger level. And we'll attach that to the player and open it up. And with our namespace set, we need to make sure we have a reference to our player. And we'll set that in awake. Now we're going to expose a couple values here. These are going to be the lowest hunger level of a various state of hungriness. We'll set the satiated to be 65 and the hungry minimum to be 30. And this essentially means that if your value is above or equal to 65, then you're satiated. Otherwise, if it's below that but above 30, you're hungry. Below that, you're going to be starving. And at 0, you're just going to be famished. And that's when maybe something else starts happening when you're famished. And we'll deal with that in just a little bit. So let's create our update method. And let's first check that the player is set up. If the player's not set up, we'll just return. Otherwise, we will check our hunger level. So our hunger level is just going to check to see if we're starving, and if we are and we don't already have the starving condition, we're going to add that. And so I'm going to add a few properties at the top in order to make it easier to know if we are starving or whatnot. So we're going to be satiated if our hunger points is greater than or equal to our satiated minimum. Now, what is our hunger points? Well, we can add a property for that as well. And that's going to return the points value from our stat of hunger level. So we're going to be hungry if our hunger points are less than the satiated minimum, but still above the hungry minimum. And then we're going to be starving if the hunger points are underneath hungry minimum, but above 0. And then we're going to be famished if our hunger points are 0 or less. And while we're up here, I'm also going to cache a property for our conditions. Now let's work on our check hunger level method. So we're going to go bottom up here. We're going to start by saying, by checking to see if we're famished. So if we're famished, and we're going to see if we already have the condition. If we have the condition, then we don't have to do anything. And otherwise, we're going to add the condition and handle other conditions that we might already have. All right, so I'm going to use the same method I did before to cache the property UIDs for the various conditions up here. And we'll add this method down here. When we get famished, we want to make sure that we don't have the other conditions. We don't want to both be hungry and famished at the same time. We're going to replace them with the others. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say conditions remove, and we'll remove the starving UID, and we'll also remove the hungry UID in case that exists. They shouldn't both be there, but in case we jump from the hungry state all the way down to the famished state, then we'll remove them both. And then we'll say conditions.add famished UID. And of course, when we add a condition, we want to add the owner, and we don't have a source for this one, and we do want to add in the player game time. And we'll add a new property up here. So we're going to do very similar things for the other states with hungry and satiated next. And for each of these methods, we're doing very similar. We're removing the other states and we're adding the state starving or hungry as appropriate. And the last one we're going to do is satiated. And there's no state that involved in satiated. There's no condition, rather, that happens when you're satiated. So we're going to just check to see if we have any of the other conditions. And when we get satiated, we're just going to make sure we remove all of the conditions. Well, that was a lot to write all at once. So now we have our script here. We have our satiated minimum, hungry minimum. And as we build up more of the project, we're noticing that we need to control the setup order of operations even more. And so now in our player setup, right before we destroy, we're going to make sure that this is what tells the player it's set up. Instead of calling this method now, we're just going to say is set up and return. So this will no longer be setting itself. And I'm going to add a note here that we've moved this. So now when we press play, we can see our hunger level going down. Let's speed it up by getting poisoned. Now when this gets to be under 65, we should see the hungry condition add up here, and we should see our stats, might and wisdom, go down just a little bit. There we go. Now we're hungry, and our final stat has gone down. Now keep in mind, points for the might and wisdom have stayed the same. We actually haven't changed the base points. It's only the final stat that's come down, and that's because the system is containing the points, which generally shouldn't change, and doing all the math for all the things that lead to the final stat. So if we continue to be poisoned here and speed this up, we're now going to be starving, and you can see that our final stats have gone down a little bit more. And then finally, if we keep ourselves poisoned, when we get down to our hunger level to be 0, we are now famished. Our stats are going down even more. And now we can add to some negative repercussions for being famished. So let's load up that famished state again. And while we do have this effect on the stats, we can add some effect on points as well. So a periodic effect, perhaps one every in-game minute, we can say that our hit points go down by 1. All right, now that we're famished, we see that our hit points are going down by 1. But now if we eat some food, then we're no longer famished and our hit points stop going down. So there you go. In this tutorial, you've learned how to set up a player for the game modules, to add stats and conditions to that player in multiple methods, to add a data viewer into the inspector so you can easily see what kind of things are going on with your character, and tied it all together into a system that lets the player get hungry, get food added to their belly, and if they can't get that food added to their belly, lose hit points over time. And then when they die, well, that's something for you to code for yourself. Thanks for hanging out and watching this tutorial. I hope you had a great time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Go over to infinitypbr.com. You can join the Discord with the big purple button. You can click into our scripting docs where, of course, all of the documents about the game modules are here, adding new stuff all the time. And then go onto the asset store, click this button, see all assets. That is our affiliate link. The link's also down below. I very much appreciate you using my affiliate link. And then check out the game modules. If you haven't bought it already, go ahead and give it a grab. It's going to save you a ton of time, and I think you're really going to enjoy using it. This tutorial just scratched the surface of what you can do with the game modules and how much time you can save by having this in your project. Thanks. Have a great day.